I'm here to give you a warning. Whatever you do, don't hike the Rock Ridge Trail. I've seen plenty of strange things since I started working here. There was the time I saw a row of 8 stars moving in a uniform, single file line across the night sky. Clark and I were on an extended trip into the backcountry at the time, and both of us went to bed that night believing, with 100% certainty, that we had witnessed aliens. The next day, we decided to pack up our tools and gear and hightail it back to base camp. We dropped our bags and whipped out our phones as soon as we entered Wi-Fi range, only to find that they were just the SpaceX Starlink satellites. Another time, there was a family who claimed they had been attacked in their sleep. They peeled out of the parking lot before I could ask what happened. When checking the campsite, I found a partially destroyed drawing in the fire pit. It looked like it was drawn by one of their kids. It depicted the 2 parents holding hands with their heads hung low. The son had drawn himself looking frightened in a tent while winged skulls bit down on the sides of the tent. He's probably going to be afraid of camping now, never knowing it was just some wild horses getting curious. They tend to wake people up by biting the sides of tents. From the inside, it really is terrifying. I mean, can you imagine a floating mouth with human-looking teeth and gums biting your tent? That would make anyone hide in their sleeping bag. But now, there is something going on that I cannot explain. I'm writing this not expecting anyone to believe me. They told me not to tell anyone, but I feel as though it's my duty to do so anyway. It all started on a day like any other. I was outside the visitor's station watering the flowers when I saw a hiker emerge from the woods at the clearing. The first thought that ran through my mind was, when you gotta go, as I watched him frantically sprint to the bathroom. But he wasn't going to the bathroom. No, as soon as he went in, he came right back out. He looked around desperately for a moment, then beelined to the visitor center. I had messed up and forgot to lock it while I was working outside. I thought the glass would shatter the way he flung the door open. He didn't listen as I shouted after him that we were closed, instead slamming the door shut behind him. I tried the door, but he had locked it. I fumbled with my keys, looked through the glass, and took a closer look at the man who had run inside. "No! Don't open it," he screamed, although muffled by the door. They followed me. The only thing on my mind was bears, or possibly bees. I turned around to look for what was chasing him and saw nothing. Then I peered back through the glass to try and get a better look at him, and he looked like hell. Sunken eyes, hysterical hair, and he looked dehydrated. Seeing an opportunity, he opened the door, grabbed me by the collar, and dragged me forcefully into the building. I fell to my knees and had to pull in my feet at the last second before he slammed the door. Even though he was talking to me, he never took his eyes off the parking lot. I could get a good look at him now, and he looked like he'd been out in the woods for weeks. His shirt was torn, and his skin was covered in scrapes and bruises. Had he been running through a briar patch, off-trail, shirtless? He was bleeding from too many places to count. I started to speak, but he interrupted me by putting his hands together and begging, "Please don't make me go back outside." "You can stay, just tell me what happened," I said, trying to calm him down. "You don't understand. The bee bathroom doors don't go all the way to the ground. There's enough space for them to get through," he said, racing around the room trying to check the seals on the windows. "What exactly is going to get through?" "What do you mean?" He grabbed my shoulders. His breath reeked as he hysterically spat. "I was attacked when I was sleeping. Got here Friday. They trapped me in my tent. I don't know what they were. Needles? I couldn't believe my eyes. Yeah, it was needles poking through the tent walls. They hurt like hell. I started to feel weak. I had to run." "Needles?" I escaped his grasp and reached over the desk for the phone. "I crushed so many of them with my hands," he continued while I dialed 911 and told them we needed an ambulance. I looked back over at him and he did not look good. He lost balance, bracing himself against the wood-paneled wall, then slid like a rag doll to the ground, just barely missing the water fountain. I rushed over and moved him carefully until he lay flat on the carpet, confirmed a pulse while simultaneously yelling for help. Ranger Clark came running inside, his eyes growing wide when he saw an unconscious body on the floor. "What happened?" he said, rushing over to help the hiker. "I don't know. He said he was attacked." "These wounds don't look like anything I've seen before. What was he attacked by?" All over his skin were scratches and unidentifiable bites. He looked like he was allergic to them, whatever they were. Maybe it was vampire bats, for all we knew. Clark disappeared into the office of Verdane, returning quickly with hands full of alcohol and gauze bandages. We treated the hiker's wounds as best we could, then waited with him on the floor, feeling useless. I spent much of those hours rethinking all of my life choices. Why was I even here? But there had been nowhere else for me to go. My parents had kicked me out. I was coasting, they said. On my 24th birthday, there were no candles. "You need to face real life as an adult," they said. I couldn't afford rent, and I didn't want to go into a lifetime of debt to go to college. But they wouldn't listen. Instead, they gave me 3 months. I applied to hundreds of jobs. No one was hiring. The amount of times I read the words 3 to 5 years relevant experience required on an entry-level job posting was discouraging, to say the least. When the email from Rockridge Park came in, I could hardly read it because my hands were shaking. I had interviewed with this ranger named Clark for a position working for the Forest Service. He explained how we would do everything together, from backcountry hiking to eating meals. He talked for a long time about how I could expect to work hard, cleaning campsites and updating the trails to prevent erosion. But truthfully, the only words I really heard him say were North Carolina. It didn't matter what the job was. Like, North Carolina was about as far away from home as I could imagine. This was an escape, so I accepted the offer. Clark emailed me a list of items the Forest Service would provide, basically food and shelter. My new home. A few days later, I was throwing my whole life and whatever backpacking gear I could assemble into the car. I hugged my mom, but my dad would hardly look at me. The lingering memory of their concerned faces as I backed out of the driveway never left my mind as I drove the hundreds of miles east to North Carolina. I've lived my whole life in Utah, so witnessing the environment change on the drive felt like a religious experience. The world out here is just so much more green, and the biodiversity is truly astounding. But all that feels like a lifetime ago. The wounded hiker shook me to my core. The EMT told us he needed blood immediately. It wasn't the wounds or the desperation in his eyes. It was the unknown. What had left those bites all over him? The next morning, Clark and I set out to investigate his campsite. There were a few possible places he could have camped, and he had chosen a campsite near the swimming hole just a few miles down the Rockridge Trail. It's one of our more popular campsites, surrounded by a quiet brook feeding into a small pond where you can swim. The hiker had left everything behind. His gear was strewn about like the aftermath of some fierce battle. His pack was tossed against a tree, with all his food still sealed inside the bear canister. Clothes were still hanging from a tree limb to dry. His tent flap was open, the zipper billowing lightly in the breeze. I peered inside and retched from an acrid smell. I took a step back, covered my nose with my shirt, steeled myself for a corpse, and looked back inside. Bear with me for what I'm going to tell you next, because it's like nothing I've ever seen. Inside the tent was a face, not a body, a face. Too small to be human, but human nonetheless. It was deflated, laying flat like a cheap latex Halloween mask, but too real to be a costume. The eyes were gray and glassy, and the nose lay at a concave angle where you could see nose hairs. The only thing I can compare it to are those melted clocks from that surrealist painting, The Persistence of Memory. The thing that still haunts me most was the hair. Patchy, wiry, human hair. A beard sprouting from oily skin. I screamed for Clark to come take a look. I was shocked, backed up too far, lost my footing on a tree stump, and fell to the ground. "What did you find?" he yelled, dropping a tarp the camper had left behind and sprinting toward me. I pointed to the open door of the tent. Clark pulled the flap back slowly, took one look inside, ducked away from the tent, and retched. It was the smell. I'm aware of what decay smells like, and this was not that. We took a second to calm down. Holding his breath, Clark grabbed a stick and fished the face out of the tent. We stood a few feet away, not knowing what to make of it. The face was attached to a small body. You could make out individual parts, like a leg here and wings there. It was completely destroyed, but we could tell that it wasn't human. Too big to be a bird or insect, but it somehow had the parts of a bird or insect. Whatever it was, the hiker had fought and killed it, smashing the small body, but the human-looking face remained. We didn't know what else to do, and it was getting dark, so we left. The long walk back to civilization started in silence. I don't think either of us felt like attracting unwelcome attention in these woods tonight. There was something big going on here. It couldn't have been his face, right? The hiker's face? I wondered if Clark was thinking what I was thinking, that it almost looked like the guy who'd been attacked. The narrow beams of light from our headlamps guided our way, providing little comfort as we trudged back to the parking lot. We were a few miles down the trail when Clark and I stopped to drink water. I was deep in my own head, thinking about getting in my car, calling the police, and leaving. "Promise not to be mad," Clark said, the beam from his headlamp blinding me. I swallowed a gulp of stale water from my bottle. "Let me guess, you made a perfect replica mask of that guy's face and put it in the tent to scare me. Then you emptied a backpack full of dead animals into it for the realistic smell." He didn't smile. "I found something else. I wasn't going to tell you because I thought you'd be mad. But it doesn't make sense to keep this from you. I'm scared, and I'm sorry. I just don't want to be the only one who knows about this in case something happens." I braced myself for what would come next. "I found something in the pond next to his campsite," Clark said, removing his pack, unzipping the largest compartment, then pulling out a t-shirt that was wrapped around something. He pulled the shirt back to reveal an elongated black rock. The light from my headlamp reflected brilliantly off the smooth surface. It was perfectly smooth and pill-shaped, about the size of a football. Clark told me to touch it. I laid my palm against it apprehensively. It was warm, alive. "We have to bring some evidence back. No one will believe us if we don't," Clark said. "We should have burned it, Clark." "We can't burn it. If it's some new species and it's coming after hikers, it's our duty as stewards of the environment and for the safety of the visitors to tell people," Clark replied. "How noble of you. If it was up to me, we'd take that thing out of your pack, lay it on the ground, and stomp on it," I responded. "I don't care if an alien embryo pops out in the sludge. We need to kill it before it hatches." "See, I knew you'd act this way," he replied. He wrapped it back in the t-shirt and closed his pack before I got any bright ideas. I fell behind on the trail. I had said my piece. I stayed far enough behind Clark to at least be ready if the creature hatched. If I was behind him, I could at least see it coming and grab something to defend myself. I thought the whole thing was short-sighted and dangerous. Evidence was not on my list of priorities at the moment. We didn't know what this thing was. I walked as fast as I could without overtaking him. Finally, we made it back. The egg went straight into the drinks cooler. We closed the latch, then stacked no less than 6 cinder blocks on top. I started packing. I had made my decision hours ago on the hike. "This isn't smart, and I don't want to be a part of it," I said, while Clark watched with a worried face. "You should come too." "You can leave. I'm not going to try to stop you, but at least wait until morning." But the dirt roads are risky to drive at night. If you got stuck or took a wrong turn, you could be weaving the switchbacks all night, Clark replied. "Also, I don't think we should split up." He had a point. At the very least, I didn't think we should split up. We had witnessed something today that could not be explained, and we were both unsettled. I decided to stay on the condition that both of us leave early in the morning together. We shook on it. Then Clark poured us both a drink. Whiskey. Neat. He disappeared for a moment into his room, opened a wooden case I'd not seen before that was stashed away under his bunk. He brought out cigarettes. I'd quit smoking, but took one anyway. We drank more than we should have while going wild with our theories. I don't remember most of them now, but we circled around a few major points. We guessed that maybe the face actually was a replica mask he'd made of himself, using skin from some animal. Maybe he got a cheap thrill from wearing it, but that didn't explain the smell. Or maybe this guy hated his twin brother with an acid hatred that poisoned every moment of their lives. Maybe he resented his brother for having the same face. Maybe he was paranoid and disturbed, so he'd murdered him, throwing his body into the pond. We laughed, letting our crazy imaginations run wild. In reality, the guy had seemed pretty normal to us. Shook up, but normal. Clark stumbled over to the logbook, where guests check in and reserve campsites. Okay, we can put that one to rest. He didn't check in with a twin brother. He smiled, lost balance, but managed to catch himself. I watched his inebriated fingers scroll slowly down a list of names until he said, "At least no one on this list." Then he paused, read silently to himself for a beat. Wait a minute. Oh shit. No, this can't be right. I jumped out of my seat, joining him at the logbook. His finger pointed at the long list of names, and the two most recent logins had not logged out. 2 names, Rachel and John from Tennessee. Checked in Friday. Destination, Rock Ridge. It was Sunday night. Most backpackers arrive on a Friday and are back at their cars by Sunday morning. These hikers never checked out. The Rock Ridge Trail is a 10-mile loop. The overlook, where most backpackers decide to set up camp, is halfway at about 5 miles there and back. Clark and I looked at each other. He broke the silence first. Sobering up is for the fishes, and he took one more swig. We started packing immediately, mechanically filling water bottles, throwing energy bars into our day packs. A 5-mile hike is not too long for us, even at night. We'd done this exact hike hundreds of times. We had spent weeks out there, living out of a base camp and working each day on maintaining the trail. I cursed when I realized I hadn't plugged in my headlamp to charge. We didn't have any weapons, but I thought we looked very resourceful when we finally landed on a pickaxe and bear spray. For a second, I almost laughed at the image of us gearing up, about to set off into the dark to rescue some poor, unaware hikers. I needed to sober up now. It's always eerie to hike at night. Having such a narrow cone of vision is just unsettling, whether you know the area or not. You can't see anything, but everything else can see you. A hiking trail is barely a refuge from the elements. In fact, bears and moose have been known to use them, just the same as humans. Clark and I clicked on our headlamps, both using red lights to avoid losing night vision. We started walking as fast as we could without wearing ourselves out. The moon lit our path until we reached the trailhead, where trees would swallow us whole for several hours. The hike was long. It felt very different at night, like the landmarks were further away. Everything blended together. Our headlamps cast light over looming tree limbs, and beetles scattered from the trail in front of our boots. Something cracked a stick just beyond the trees, but we just kept moving. At one point, I heard Clark say to himself, "Miles before smiles." It was an old hiking mantra, usually said by people who were tired. At least we were sober now and able to take in the gravity of our situation. I felt disoriented when we arrived at the base of the hill. We're about 5 miles deep on Rock Ridge Trail. You will emerge from a densely wooded area and find yourself in a clearing at the base of a hill. It's a stunning spot. The views are amazing. It's one of my personal favorites. A popular spot for hikers to stop and have a break, partly because it's beautiful during the day, and partly because you can see what lies ahead. You are going to climb a hill, a huge hill. The elevation change at this point in the trail is higher than any other point in the park. You stop here to fortify yourself. Clark and I were drinking water when we saw them. The campers were staying at one of the more popular campsites, the one near the ridge. The light coming from their tent was flickering on and off, on and off, on and off. We stared at the light, both quickly recognizing the pattern. 3 short flips of the light followed by 3 long flips, then 3 short flips again. SOS in Morse code. We sprinted up the mountain. I was completely out of breath as I got closer to their tent. There was this mysterious buzzing noise like a helicopter that was very far away. As I got closer, it began to sound more like a housefly does when it flies close to your ear, but at 10 times the scale. Finally, I crested the last rock step and turned my head to point the light at the tent. The buzzing was coming from inside. There was an erratic battering against the inner walls of the tent. It sounded like wings. Just then, the girl inside saw my light and screamed for help. I shouted back that I was coming. Clark was right behind me as we approached the tent. The sound was so loud now. The tent was covered with a separate outer waterproof layer known as a rain fly, like one tent set up over a smaller tent to keep the rain out. I unzipped the outer door, and what was inside will haunt me for the rest of my days. They were like giant flying insects. They hovered between the inner and outer tent like hummingbirds, their wings beating against the material. If they saw the opportunity, they would poke their needle-like mouth through the mesh windows, aiming to make contact with the poor hiker's skin. The needles made sense now. On their backs, they had large sacs filled with red liquid, probably blood. The beating of their wings was impossibly loud. They sensed me behind them, retracted their needles from the tent walls with surgical precision, then flew off into the night. I tried to follow them with my light and immediately lost them in the trees. They were too quick, their wings moving at a speed I would not have thought possible for their size. They looked like hummingbirds or dragonflies when they flew, like they could move at any angle, forward, back, or diagonal. I opened the tent flap again. The hikers were both inside. I asked the girl, who I knew to be Rachel, if she was okay. She was clutching a sleeping pad, halfway deflated, and had been using it to bat away the needles as they repeatedly lunged for her skin. She was panicked, completely and utterly traumatized. The boy was passed out behind her. I whispered that it was going to be okay, instructed her to stay put, and that I would be right back. Clark and I searched the clearing. Our lights bounced from one tree to the other. We waited for the sound of wings. We didn't know much, but at least we knew they were either too far away for us to hear them, or they had landed. Clark startled me when he grabbed my arm. I looked to where his headlamp was pointing. He was illuminating a low tree branch about 10 feet high. The creature was perched there, like an owl. I thought I would lose my mind just looking at it. A human face sat there on an insect's body, with a dull expression. The face did not blink, nor did the pupils dilate in the light. It was like a face that was missing the crucial essence that it takes to look truly human. Its body was segmented, all black, like an insect. It just sat there, grooming its front legs with its back legs. The wings were folded back, resting behind it. The transparent material reflected our headlamps, flashing when it caught the correct angle. The eyes never once turned to look at us. Suddenly, we heard the sound of wings closing in on us from a distance. We braced ourselves, not wanting to take our light away from the creature perched above. The beating of wings got closer and closer, then stopped. Another one had landed in the same tree, the weight of its body causing tremors down the length of the branch. Both creatures stayed hauntingly still as we watched them from below. I didn't know what to do. It was eerily silent for a moment, broken only when the hiker screamed from inside the tent, "For the love of God, kill them!" At that moment, they moved in unison. They descended from the tree to the ground, leaves scattering as they landed. They started walking toward us. They looked like crickets when they walked on the ground. But crickets with blank human faces, twitching and cocking to the side as they approached. I was terrified, but I felt the weight of the pickaxe in my hand. I had carried it all this way. I was res then. Clark disappeared. Leaving me? No. Grabbing a boulder from the fire pit. They kept coming closer and closer, our light never leaving them for a second. Just a few feet away now, I realized they had the faces of the boy and the girl in the tent. The mimicry was uncanny. I couldn't believe my eyes. The creature on the right had blue eyes like the girl. The creature approaching on the left had a strong jaw and dark rims around its eyes, like the boy. I braced, ready to swing the pickaxe down with all my strength. I was sure one of them was going to start running at me, and I'd miss, and it would scurry up my leg. Then it would stab me through the heart with its needle mouth and extract the DNA needed to mimic my face. But they didn't. They just kept walking toward us, slowly in unison. They were nearly within my range when they opened their mouths wide, revealing a cavernous pit of teeth and gums. If they spoke, I would have screamed. I couldn't move. A black snake, like an elephant's trunk, emerged from the back of their throats. Just then, Clark heaved his boulder. It went through the air in slow motion, making direct contact with the bug, imitating the boy. The boulder smashed down on top of it, a direct hit. The other insect, the one imitating the girl, skittered away into the trees. I looked back at the injured creature. It was trying to escape mechanically, like an insect stuck to a glue trap. I brought my pickaxe down on its face. It stopped moving. Clark and I looked at each other. "Where did the other one go?" I asked, eyes darting from tree to tree. "I don't know, but keep looking. They can run as fast as they can fly," Clark replied. The second insect skittered toward my feet, too fast for me to swing my pickaxe. I swung, missed, and jumped into the air at the last second to avoid it running up my legs. The creature ran underneath me and disappeared again into the trees. We heard it fly, then stop. Fly, then stop. Clark and I stood back to back, me holding my pickaxe and Clark wielding bear spray. I looked up, and it was directly above me. It dropped onto me from the trees. I ducked so it didn't land on my face. It was so heavy, and its talons dug into my back. I dropped my pickaxe and started reaching behind me, frantically trying to tear it off. I caught its wings and pulled as hard as I could, throwing it to the ground. It tried to fly away, but Clark immediately started dousing it with bear spray. It was stunned, disabled. It started hopping away blindly, but we caught up to it. Clark jumped onto it with both his feet, crushing it beneath his boots. It was like he jumped into a rain puddle. Blood splattered everywhere, on him, me, and the tent. There was no time to lose. I asked the girl if she could walk. She said yes. We abandoned the campsite, Clark carrying the unconscious boy in his arms, and we set out on the long trek back. I could start to see their wounds as the morning light filtered through the trees. They were both covered in the same bumps that the first hiker was covered in. Perfect raised circles with a single spot of blood in the center. They looked like huge mosquito bites to me now. My mind went wild on the long walk back. These creatures took on the likeness of the animals they drank the blood of. It had to be some old-world evolutionary advantage that a long-extinct creature would have. I shouldn't be telling you any of this, but that all happened a few weeks ago. The park has been closed since then, but I still feel like it's my duty to warn any would-be hikers. A team came out. They were probably from the government, but I don't really know. They wouldn't tell me anything. Their vans were unmarked, but they did wear uniforms. The uniforms had this weird symbol that I didn't recognize, like a circle with arrows pointing inwards. I dug around on the internet and found a website for this organization called SCP. It stands for Secure, Contain, Protect. We showed them our cooler where we stashed the egg that Clark found in the water. It had already hatched and was bashing around inside the cooler. But luckily, the cinder blocks held tight. I watched as the SCP people drilled a hole in the top of the cooler. The black snake from the bug's mouth tried to get through, but the team quickly fed a clear tube through the hole. They filled the cooler with some liquid, and the cooler went silent. They carted that off, but not before wrapping it 3 times with what looked like regular duct tape. They told us to hold back. that we couldn't go with them, but Clark and I insisted that we needed to show them the swimming hole where we found the egg. When we got there, they didn't waste time. They donned scuba gear, several of them disappearing under the water. We waited. When they came out, they spoke among themselves for a while. They walked us back into the woods, then gave a signal to the man with the detonator. A tremor rocked the earth below me. They were thorough and very professional. They told us that they have ways of killing the queen. They said the nest shouldn't bother us anymore and that it's safe to swim. But I'm not so sure. Sometimes when I look out the window at night, I think I see my own face hovering outside the glass, looking back at me. This is a warning. Please do not hike the Rock Ridge Trail. I've been flying as a bush pilot in Alaska for the last 5 years or so. It's a pretty good job for the right sort of person. It goes without saying that you need to be a pretty handy pilot, specifically of small and light aircraft. But beyond that, it also requires a special sort of personality. Folks who thrive on social interaction and the safe comfort of civilization need not apply. Being self-sufficient and mechanically inclined are pretty much prerequisites for those who want to stay on this side of the grave. And I'd say it's fairly important that you have a level head and don't have a tendency to panic in stressful situations. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not talking about thrill seekers or those who don't have a healthy respect for death. Those folks don't tend to last too long in this business. They either end up as another in the long list of missing planes that gain new entries each year, or else they quickly learn that their employers aren't willing to risk their expensive equipment and cargo with someone that isn't going to take every possible precaution to ensure the safe return of said aircraft. I'm just saying that you have to be able to set your fears aside when you're in the thick of it. If something goes wrong, you need a clear head. You can always puke or pass out once you're safely on the ground again. I've had my share of cold sweats, standing on a frozen runway after a close brush with the afterlife. Me, I'm a transplant from South Florida, where I spent much of my time doing puddle jump charters in a small twin-engine Beechcraft. Interesting, sure, but dealing with people has never been my strong suit. I'm not exactly the sociable sort, even less so when I'm trying to fly. When you've got 4 passengers sitting a couple feet behind you and expecting you to play tour guide on their 2-hour flight across the Everglades, it gets old pretty quick. Or at least it did for me. I guess it works for some people. Anyway, a flying buddy of mine that I hadn't talked to in years called me up out of the blue one day with a lead on an open seat at the Bush Charter Company he'd been working with out of Fairbanks. One of their pilots had decided that the harsh Alaskan winters in isolation were more than his nerves could take, so he gave his notice, packed his bags, and headed back south. Truth be told, I had never really considered looking for a gig in Alaska. I always had the impression that most of the bush pilots working there had been flying STOL, that's short takeoff and landing, in the backcountry since they were old enough to walk. Nick assured me that there were plenty of respected pilots up there who had originated from the lower 48. When he floated the salary numbers in my direction, I didn't take too long thinking about it before I'd made my decision, and 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in the offices of my new employer. That was a while back, and although it took a bit to become accustomed to the type of bush flying that this place demands, I settled in pretty quick and was soon assigned my permanent ride, a de Havilland DHC-2 Beaver. Maggie, after a yellow lab I had as a kid. Man, what a beauty she is. Solar yellow with black piping and looking just as pristine as when she rolled off the assembly line in 1967. The Beaver is probably the best bush plane to ever grace the skies, and I'm fairly certain that Maggie saved my ass from a stupid mistake on more than one occasion. Anyway, I'm getting off track. So at the time this story took place, I'd been flying for Viking Bush Charters for probably a year or so. I just returned from dropping supplies to a ranger station up near Denali when I got a call over the radio from my dispatcher. I was in the hangar at the time, getting a hot cup of coffee while the mechanic was refitting Maggie with her Tundra tires, swapping out the floats I'd needed for the supply drop-off earlier. The big, almost cartoonish tires were perfect for most of the areas I tended to fly into and made for a soft, if energetic, landing. I was looking forward to getting back to my trailer and relaxing, maybe watching a movie before dozing off, but the crackle from my two-way told me that my exciting plans for the night might not play out. "Go for Hooper," I answered, taking a sip of the steaming coffee. The voice of Buck Jacobs replied through the light static. "Hey, Hoop, what's your status?" Mike is working on Maggie's gear, and I was getting ready to head home for the evening. What's up?" There was a moment's pause before Buck replied. "Sorry, Hoop, but I need you to do a turnaround. We just got a call from a ranger station up near Birch Creek. They've got someone up there that had a run-in with a brown bear and is pretty banged up." I cursed under my breath, but there wasn't any real venom in it. I learned a while ago that up here, everybody helps when it's needed. You never know when it's going to be you on the other side of that call. "Can't they fly him out themselves?" I asked, but I was already walking around my plane to where Mike Nichols was working. "Negative, Hoop. It's an emergency and we're the nearest phone call. I'd send Jackie, but she's not back from her run up to Minto yet," he replied. "Okay, Buck, no worries. I'll help Mike get Maggie refit and prepped. I should be wheels up in an hour or so," I said. "Thanks, Hoop. I'll have the details in your hands in 15. Dispatch out." And there went my relaxing evening. True to my prediction, I was taxiing down the company's private runway an hour later, the vibration from the big radial engine creating a gentle thrumming that filled the interior. It was just before 3 p.m. when I was airborne, and being that it was late February, I knew I had just over 2 hours before sunset. So long as everything went smoothly, that should have been enough time to reach the ranger station, load up the passenger, and get back to Fairbanks before dark. The weather was pretty good when I left. It was pushing plus 10 degrees, and although the reports were calling for snow that evening, the sky was clear as I rose above the trees and turned northeast towards the ranger station. Everything was going smoothly for the first 30 minutes before those distant storm clouds I'd been watching on the horizon suddenly seemed to take a keen interest in me and headed my way much faster than I'd have liked. To make matters worse, I'd started to notice a subtle bumping sensation intermittently coming from the engine. I wasn't sure if I was starting to lose one of the 9 cylinders or if it was something else, but it was definitely something I was keeping my eye on. If I'd been on a regular supply run, I'd have turned around and headed back to Fairbanks right then and there to get it checked out. But I was acutely aware that anyone who'd had a tangle with a grizzly was probably in a bad way. My flight out to the Birch Creek Ranger Station may very well mean the difference between life and death for this unfortunate soul. After another 15 minutes, I knew that I wasn't going to make it to the ranger station. The storm clouds that had been approaching had now overtaken me and covered the afternoon sky in a thick blanket of gray-black ugliness. I could see the periodic flashes of lightning within them, and the air had grown turbulent. To make matters worse, that engine miss I'd been feeling had become more frequent and severe, and I was sure that I now had multiple cylinders that were beginning to fail. I grabbed the VHF and radioed back to dispatch. "Viking ground, Viking 320 Foxtrot." Buck's voice crackled through a moment later. "Viking 320 Foxtrot, Viking ground, reading you, Hoop." "Buck, I've run into some nasty weather here and have started picking up some engine issues. I'm afraid I'm going to have to abort and head for home. Please advise Birch Creek Ranger Station of my situation." Buck didn't argue. He knew I wouldn't abort a pickup like this for a few snow flurries. "Roger that, Hoop," looking at the weather radar now. Advise you make your heading 185 degrees and drop to 900 to avoid the worst of it. Roger that. Viking 320 Foxtrot out, I said, banking the plane to the right and starting my return to the airfield. The storm front, which had overtaken me from my left, had also descended with its approach, bringing the clouds low and thick. I pushed forward on the yoke, starting my descent to Buck's recommendation and hoping that there weren't any errant mountains in my way. 5 minutes later, I was fighting with the wind for control of Maggie and was now nearly in a whiteout condition, relying almost exclusively on my instruments for navigation. The turbulence was getting severe, tossing the workhorse bushplane around like a kite in a gale. More than once, the groaning of the wing struts made me wonder if the storm was pushing Maggie past her comfort zone and testing the limits of her airframe. I descended a bit more, dropping to 500 feet, aware that in these low visibility conditions, I was pushing my luck with the terrain. The air was a little cleaner down here, though, and the visibility a little better, but I was still being thrown around, and I knew I'd have to climb again pretty soon in order to clear the ridgeline I knew was not too far ahead of me. An unnerving, metallic popping noise from above my head drew my attention momentarily, and in that moment, I made the decision that I had to find a place to set her down and wait out the storm as best I could. The trees below me were becoming visible now at this altitude, their peaks piercing the low cloud cover and heavy snowfall like ghostly claws, reaching up from the depths of some abyssal grave to drag me down. The biggest issue I faced now was finding a suitable place to land safely. I knew that the winds had pushed me off course, and I wasn't as familiar with this area as most others I spent time flying over. I wasn't aware of any landing strips nearby and was just praying to find a large enough clearing to accommodate her. Another engine miss, worse this time. The strained drone of the radial cut out completely for a half second before resuming, and for the first time since I'd come to Alaska, I realized that there was a very real possibility that I might not make it home. If the engine died completely in what was now a strong tailwind, my airspeed would quickly drop until one of my wings stalled. When that happened, the Beaver would wing over and I'd tumble to the ground in an unrecoverable death spiral. It might be months or years before my wreckage was discovered out here in the wilderness. I considered trying to turn into the wind to keep as much airspeed as possible in that event, but it was gusting bad enough that I was afraid to attempt it, especially with a limping engine. I was getting ready to radio dispatch and let Buck know of my worsening situation when the thick clouds parted ahead of me briefly. In that instant, I thought I'd won the most important lottery of my life. Directly ahead of me, a quarter of a mile out, was the unmistakable rectangular shape of a small airstrip. It was covered in snow that I hoped wasn't too deep, but it was my salvation, a lifeline that I wouldn't dare refuse. I quickly adjusted my approach and set my flaps as I made for it. Another strong gust fought me, trying to throw me out of alignment with the narrow clearing, but I fought back with throttle and rudder as best I could as I watched the altimeter steadily wind down like an analog clock going backward in time. I reached out for the radio handset to advise Buck of my situation and estimated location, but the next gust almost tore the yoke out of my left hand, and I snapped instantly back to a white-knuckled, two-handed grip. My altitude dropped to 200 feet. I was going too fast. I knew. At this speed, I'd either overshoot the strip altogether and slam into the dense tree line, or hit the ground so hard that I'd shear off my gear and probably break my back in the process. I couldn't slow her down any further, though, or I would risk dropping below stall speed in the strong tailwind, and that would mean a quick trip to the frozen ground. 100 feet. Maggie's wings dipped below the tree line now, as I entered the long and narrow swath of the landing strip, the tall cedars and spruces towering around me forebodingly. The tailwind dropped, obstructed by the great barrier of trees behind me, and I took a breath to thank whatever powers that be for this unexpected bit of good fortune. 50 feet. With the flaps set to full, I bled off airspeed quickly, and my reflexes took over, transitioning from my near-ballistic flight to a more controlled approach, one the Beaver was much more suited to. 10 feet. I pulled back on the yoke and momentarily throttled up as my gear kissed the top of the snow, flaring the bush plane and setting down a bit harder than I would have liked, the jarring of the impact thankfully cushioned by the Tundra tires. I rolled out for another 20 feet or so before Maggie came to a halt in the knee-deep snow, thankful that I hadn't nosed over. I killed the engine and rested my forehead on the yoke, trying to get my heart rate under control. I didn't think the shaking of my hands had anything to do with the temperature. The daylight was fading, but it was still light enough to allow me a good view of my surroundings through Maggie's windows. I was in the middle of what I guessed was the landing strip, since the tree lines on either side seemed to be about the same distance from me. Those trees were even more imposing down here on the ground. They rose like towering walls on either side, and the woodlands beyond held deep shadows that were only accentuated by the heavy snowfall that continued to obscure my vision. I reached for the radio and keyed the mic, hailing dispatch. I didn't have much faith that the VHF would be able to penetrate the trees and the mountain ridge that lay between me and Buck, but it was worth a shot. After a long moment of hissing static, I tried again, but with the same results. It was doubtful that I'd be able to get a signal through until the storm passed, and even then, I didn't think it likely unless I could get Maggie airborne again. With only a moment's deliberation and a resigned sigh, I retrieved the emergency locator beacon from my jacket pocket and activated it. The unit would broadcast a distress signal along with my location to the monitoring service. I knew it would be a day, at least, before help arrived, but the sooner I sent the call, the sooner they'd be able to get to me. I took another look out through the fuselage windows. If there was a landing strip, that meant a possibility that someone was nearby. I didn't think there was a ranger station out here, but there were enough hunting cabins and homesteads that there was a decent chance I could find shelter. The interior of the plane was still warm, but I knew that wouldn't last very long in this weather, especially with night approaching. I unbuckled myself and climbed back through the seats into the cargo area, where I pulled on my heavy coat and shouldered my emergency pack. Grabbing my rifle from its rack behind the pilot's seat, I unlatched and swung open the cargo door. A blast of Arctic wind hit me in the face, and I squinted my eyes against it, quickly pulling my goggles on and my hood up before dropping to the snow-covered runway. I pulled the cargo door closed and trudged around the rear of the plane, standing in the furrows left by Maggie's wheels and turning in a slow circle as I tried to discern any indication of human presence. Despite the howling wind that pulled at my coat and hood, I caught the unmistakable scent of wood smoke and breathed a small sigh of relief. At least I knew I wasn't alone out here. As I scanned my surroundings, my eyes alighted on what looked like a small utility shed on the western edge of the clearing, and I moved with as much speed as the deep snow would allow in its direction. To the left of it, I spied a waist-high railing marking a walkway that led into the shadowed tree line and quickened my pace. I followed the trail, now feeling what were likely wooden planks beneath my boots. Once in the trees, the brutal wind of the storm lessened, and the snow drifted down from the canopy in slow, dancing swirls before settling on the ground with a muted hiss that sounded like the forest around me was quietly exhaling. Between the dim light of the coming dusk and the snowfall, I couldn't see much beyond the trees nearest me, and I relied on the handrail to guide my travel. It was another few minutes of plodding through the snow-covered walkway before I finally saw the building. At first, I thought it was a hunting cabin, solitary amidst the endless sea of trees. As I drew closer, though, I could see it was much larger than I first thought, low and wide and of modern construction. Some sort of sign stood between two timber uprights just off the path, its face covered in snow and ice. I paused to brush it clear, somewhat surprised to see the blue background and logo of the Alaskan Division of Agriculture. White lettering beneath it indicated that this was the White River Basin Agricultural Research Center. I'd never heard of the ADOA having wilderness research centers, but I supposed it wasn't too far-fetched. Regardless, this was even better news than I'd expected. This meant that I wasn't approaching some isolated hunting camp, but instead a government post. And that meant my chances of survival and rescue had just increased significantly. I gave a hoot of joy and patted the sign as if it were an old friend who had just delivered some good news, and jogged the remaining handful of yards to the front door of the building. Just as I approached, however, the door abruptly swung open, spilling yellow light across the white snow. A man stepped out from the doorway and shouldered a shotgun, leveling it right at my head, his eyes wide and wild as they stared down the barrel at me. "Stop right there," he shouted at me, his words coming in angry puffs of steam in the frigid air. "Don't come any closer." "Whoa, hold on a minute, Chief. Just wait," I answered, my hands going up reflexively. "I'm not here to cause any trouble," he motioned with the shotgun. "Drop the rifle, nice and slow. I'm warning you, I won't hesitate to blow you in half if you make any sudden moves." Holding my free hand up to show I was no threat, I bent slowly and placed the rifle on the ground before rising again. "What's going on? Who are you? What are you doing here?" he demanded. I could see the muzzle of the shotgun trembling and worried that he might end up shooting me by mistake just due to nerves. He was wearing what looked like a government-issued coat with an embroidered patch on the shoulder and had a week's growth of beard. "Easy, boss," I said, trying to keep my voice level and calm. "My name's Hooper. I'm a pilot for Viking Bush Charters out of Fairbanks. My plane was forced down in the storm, and I was lucky to find your landing strip before she ended up in the trees." I was starting to wonder if lucky was the right word anymore. He looked at me a long minute, his eyes scanning me over, then motioned at me again with the shotgun. "Take off your goggles. Let me see your eyes," he said. That caught me off guard, but I nodded and slowly moved my hands to remove the tinted goggles, careful not to make any sudden moves. He leaned toward me, eyes locked hard on mine, searchingly. Then, seemingly satisfied, he abruptly lowered his gun and nodded, as if reassuring himself. He jerked his head back toward the doorway, and his entire demeanor suddenly changed. "Well, Hooper, come on inside and bring your rifle. It's too damned cold out here." With that, he turned and walked back inside, resting the shotgun against the interior wall next to the door as he did so. Now, even more confused than before, I reached down and picked up my rifle from the snowy ground, my gaze never leaving the man. As inconspicuously as I could, I worked the lever, chambering a cartridge, and followed him in. It was such a bizarre interaction. I wanted to make sure he wouldn't surprise me again if he decided to change his mind. When I entered the building and closed the door behind me, I found myself in what looked like a wood-paneled visitor's room, with a couch on one wall and a blazing fireplace fronted by a couple of chairs on the opposite. The man had moved over to a small table near the fireplace, pouring a glass of whiskey from a half-empty bottle, and now seemingly completely disinterested in my presence. I frowned and glanced around the room. Aside from the sparse furnishings, there was a closed door across from the one I had entered through, labeled with a restricted access sign. The man took a long drink from his glass and turned back to me, holding the whiskey bottle out to me and offering. I just shook my head. "Sorry about all that," he said, gesturing vaguely to the door behind me. "Can't be too careful. I'm Morgan Tate, Field Research." I eyed him cautiously. "Okay, Morgan Tate, do you make a habit of welcoming visitors with a shotgun?" I still wasn't sure exactly who I was dealing with here, but something was clearly off. He just grinned at some private joke that he alone shared and then ducked his head in a nod, taking another swallow of the whiskey. "Lately? Yeah, or at least I would if I got any visitors." He pointed at me with his tumbler and sat heavily in the chair. I was starting to get the impression that this wasn't the first coup of the day for Mr. Morgan Tate. "You're the first living person I've seen in more than a week," he added. "Are you the only one here?" I asked, looking around the room. There was a row of hooks on the wall beside the door, and I took note of several coats hung there. He smirked, something unreadable behind his eyes. "Now, yeah." I didn't know what sort of game he was playing at, but I was starting to lose my patience. "Care to elaborate on that? I'm having kind of a rough day, and you're not making it any easier." The dark-haired man finished off his drink and stood. "Sure, why not? I suppose you're part of this now," he said, moving past me toward the restricted access door. I followed him as he pushed the door open and proceeded along a narrow, tiled corridor, lit by harsh fluorescent lights. It felt out of place, more like I was walking through the halls of a hospital than an A2A building in the middle of the bush. He looked over his shoulder and took note of my surprise. "Yeah, not quite like the ranger stations, is it?" he said, stopping in front of a heavy-looking door at the end of the corridor and keying a quick code into the panel above the handle. I heard a soft click, and he pushed it open, exposing a darkened room beyond. He entered, and the lights flickered on as I followed. The room we now stood in was larger than the previous one, probably 30 feet across and smelling of antiseptic and chemicals. Several rows of stainless steel tables were neatly arranged within, occupied with various unfamiliar laboratory paraphernalia and equipment. In addition to these lab stations, there also appeared to be examination tables along the far wall, a few of which had white cloths covering unidentifiable shapes. I suppressed a shudder. It reminded me of a morgue, though the concealed objects were too small to be human bodies. "What is this place?" I asked, my eyes taking it all in. "Just like the sign outside says, Hooper, this is the White River Basin Agricultural Research Center," he replied, leaning against one of the tables. "It was set up to monitor large mammal wildlife migrations with potential correlation to climate change." "Huh," I replied evenly. "Sounds interesting." He grinned. "No, it doesn't. Not even to me, and I work here. Would you believe that a week ago there were 25 researchers living and working here? 25, Hooper. This place was hopping, man." An uncomfortable tingle ran down my spine, and I shifted the rifle in my hand, the weight of it reassuring as it hung at my side. If Tate noticed, he didn't mention it. "What happened last week?" I asked carefully. When he turned back to me, the smirk was gone from his face and his eyes had widened. Whatever was in his thoughts now, he didn't find it amusing anymore. "That's when they came, Hooper." "They? The shadows, man. The shadows! They came from the storm. You remember the storm, don't you?" The storm. I knew what he was talking about, of course. I don't think anyone around here would forget it anytime soon. It was a little more than a week ago when that freak blizzard came out of nowhere, unpredicted and unexplained. What had started out as a cloudless and unseasonably warm morning ended up burying us in nearly 2 feet of snow by the time it was over. The sky had shifted from bright and sunny to a bruised and angry granite color within the span of an hour, clouds rolling so low and heavy that it seemed like you could almost reach up and touch them. Our weather station at the field was clocking sustained wind speeds of 50 knots, with gusts up to 85, and we were in a total whiteout condition for the next 14 hours. We were all trapped in the hangar, huddled around the kerosene jet heaters, listening to the wind as it tried to tear apart the heavy steel structure around us. By the time the next day came, it was just gone, replaced by the clear blue skies of the previous morning. Nobody had any good explanation for it, but I'd heard a couple of the old-timers who ran the machine shop whispering about it in the back. I couldn't make out much of what they were saying. I didn't much care, if I'm being honest. But they sounded worried. At the time, I thought it was a little strange that the weather would unnerve them as much as it seemed to. These guys were both full-blood Inuit and as hard as nails. It was almost comical to think they'd be worried about a surprise blizzard. No, no. Now that I think back on it, it almost seemed like they were more worried about something in the blizzard. I can't be sure since they kept switching in and out of English, but that's the impression I got anyway. The shadows? I asked, confused. His eyes had drifted off into the distance for a moment, lost in his own world. In the next moment, he snapped them back to me eagerly, like he'd just had an epiphany, and said, "Yeah. Do you want to see one?" Do I want to see a shadow? What the hell are you talking about, man? You're not making any sense. But he was already on the move again, walking across the room to another door. He beckoned me to follow, entered his code, and pushed it open. Wordlessly, I followed, unease whispering in my ear. He led me along another hallway, glancing over his shoulder periodically like he was making sure I was still there. I caught one. The other researchers didn't think it was possible, but I knew I could, he said, and it almost sounded like he was talking to himself more than to me. He stopped at a door marked OR2, pushed it open, and walked inside. I trailed behind him hesitantly, feeling apprehensive about this whole thing. A slow feeling of dread had been worming its way through my subconscious, and I wasn't so sure I wanted to follow this man much further. The whole situation felt wrong, and I was starting to think that Mr. Morgan Tate was more than a little unhinged. Where were the other researchers he'd mentioned? I'd question whether they ever existed at all, if not for the size of the place and the coats hanging by the door in the reception area. The room I stepped into now was much smaller than the others and had the feel of some sort of control room. The wall to my left held narrow lockers and a rack of coat hooks occupied by several white lab coats. To my right was a console lined with monitors and keyboards. And above that, the entire upper portion of the wall appeared to be an observation window looking into a darkened room. On the opposite wall was one of those airlock doors that you see in isolation areas of hospitals, stainless steel and with a small circular window in its smooth surface. The computer monitors were on and were displaying various graphs and streams of data. Tate sat on one of the chairs at the console and started typing into the keyboard. "They're incredible," he said absently, "like nothing we've ever seen before." I moved closer to the observation window, straining to make out anything in the darkened room beyond. All I saw was the Stygian blackness, though. "You have something in there?" I asked, suddenly feeling very uncomfortable. I wasn't sure I wanted to see whatever this nutcase wanted to show me. "Why are the lights off?" He glanced away from the console for a second and turned an unreadable grin on me. "They're not." With that, he stood and leaned forward, pounding the heel of his fist against the window with a resounding shudder, making me jump in surprise. I didn't quite understand what I saw next. The darkness that had obscured my view suddenly swept aside, like someone snatching a curtain violently from across a window and out of sight. But that wasn't quite right either, though. It was more fluid in its abrupt motion, almost like smoke being pulled away by an incredibly powerful and unseen exhaust fan. A muted screeching sound reached my ears, sounding eerily like a poor imitation of a bird of prey. I assumed that the observation room was soundproof, or near enough, and wondered exactly how loud that wailing must have been for it to reach my ears. I leaned closer to the window, peering upward and to the left where the darkness had disappeared to, but I couldn't see any vestige of it. And then I looked to the rest of the room and drew an involuntary gasp at the horror I saw. A dozen corpses lay strewn about the otherwise barren interior of the room, but they weren't bodies anymore. Not really. They were nothing more than skeletons now, still dressed in the clothes they'd worn when they fell. Most were intact, though a few had scattered where they struck the tiled floor. The bones were stripped of all remnants of flesh and were bleach white. "What the hell?" I said. Tate nodded excitedly. "It's incredible, isn't it?" The others left, but I was able to lure two of them into the holding room and trap them there. I stepped back, feeling my stomach turn, and turned an incredulous gaze upon the man. "But the bodies," he nodded again, almost eagerly. "That's how I lured them. Most of the remaining researchers fled in here to hide. You see, it needs to eat, to hunt. It can't survive without sustenance, no more than you or I. There were two in the beginning, but after the food ran out, this one turned on the other, and now there's only one. The food? You mean those people? I tightened the grip on my rifle and took a step backward to put a little space between the two of us. When the shadows came in the darkness of the storm, a few of them were able to slip into the building before we realized what was happening. Half of the researchers were taken that night, in their sleep. You see, they hide and wait for the right moment. They avoid the light. I think it weakens them. But in the darkness, he trailed off. And I saw an uncomfortable smile grow across his lips, almost of admiration, it seemed. In the darkness, that's where they live. That's where they thrive, where they reign. I took another step backward, my free hand reaching for the door handle behind me and opening it, pushing it with my foot. "You're crazy," I said, bringing the rifle up in line with his chest. If he even noticed it, he gave no indication. His eyes had taken on that maniacal glint again, and he stood, giving a small nod that I thought was meant to reassure me. "There's no more for it to eat, Hooper. It's been days since I've been able to feed it." He took a slow step toward me, and I matched it with a retreating one of my own. He smiled and continued, as if explaining to a child. "I have only myself left to offer, but that's not enough. Don't you understand? This isn't just a thing, not just an animal. It's far beyond our understanding, far beyond our own primitive evolution. It's perfect." His eyes flicked away from me for a moment to an illuminated red button on the console nearby, and his hand drifted over to it. "Don't!" I shouted, bringing the rifle up to my shoulder. "Don't do it, Tate." "There's nothing to be afraid of," he said, an obscene caricature of gentleness filling his voice. "It's quick." His hand hovered over the button. "I will shoot you, Tate. Don't make me do it." From where I stood, I could see another of those airlock doors through the observation window, and to my horror, a swirling mass of impenetrable blackness massed at the threshold. I could almost feel its anticipation. This wasn't the first time it had been fed. It knew what was coming. In that instant, when my eyes flicked away from him, Tate stabbed at the button. With a curse, I squeezed the trigger on the rifle at the same instant, but it was too late. The deafening report in the small room was immense, but even as the round tore through the man's chest, he'd already pressed it. I watched in horror as the twin airlock doors began to retract, and without another thought, I turned and fled as fast as my weary muscles could carry me. Thankfully, the codes required to open the doors weren't needed to exit them, and I flew down the hall and through the research room. As I passed it and threw open the door to the reception area, I heard that wailing screech again from somewhere behind me, haunting and otherworldly, echoing through the empty facility, much louder than before. Then I heard another sound, this one the agonized screaming of Morgan Tate. I only gave it the briefest of thoughts as I jerked open the outer door and fled into the snowstorm. I could only hope that feeding time would give me enough of a window to make it back to Maggie. The air had darkened even more with the coming of dusk and had grown colder. Thankfully, the storm seemed to have lost much of its fury, the front having now passed by and leaving me in its relatively calm wake. I ran along the path, just enough light remaining of the day to follow the tracks I'd made on my way in. The rifle was heavy in my grip, but I didn't dare lose my only defense. When that howling screech echoed through the trees behind me, I redoubled my speed, praying that it wouldn't be able to find me before I'd reached Maggie. The frigid air burned my lungs, and my throat was raw by the time I reached the snow-covered landing strip. I almost cried with joy at the sight of my bright yellow Maggie, waiting patiently for my return. I reached the cargo hatch and swung it open, throwing myself inside and pulling it shut behind me just as another of those haunting wails reached my ears. Closer this time. Much closer. I didn't dare look out the windows as I threw off my pack and rifle and climbed back into the pilot's seat. I buckled on my harness and my hands danced over the controls, the startup procedure second nature. Battery master on, fuel selector to center, mixture lever forward, fuel oil shut off lever down. A resounding high-pitched howl penetrated the cabin and something black moved outside, rushing from window to window, door to door, searching. It was here now, trying to find a way inside. Concentrate. Throttle at 10%, fuel pressure pumped to 5 psi, engine primed. I froze. My windshield had suddenly gone completely black, shrouding me in darkness. Even though I couldn't see anything in the featureless void just a foot away from my face, I could feel its desperation. I felt its sightless gaze, and below that, some dark malice, an inhuman and alien hunger. I pressed the starter switch, and the 9-cylinder radial engine started turning over. Slowly at first, laggard and sluggish. My blood chilled as I realized that it wasn't catching, wasn't starting. My thoughts flew back to the engine problems I'd been experiencing before my emergency landing, and in that moment, I was certain my luck had finally run out. But then, a backfire, then another, and then a third, coughing black puffs of smoke from the exhaust. And then it caught, and that big, beautiful Pratt & Whitney radial took over, the loud drone rising smooth and steady as Maggie woke from her slumber. I pushed the throttle forward, inertia pressing me into my seat. I no longer cared about the engine misfires or the storm. A fiery death in the trees was preferable to whatever that thing had in store for me, I was sure. The snow was deep, and even with the big Tundra tires, I had to work to keep from nosing over as I began to gain speed. At some point, the black mass disappeared from my windscreen, and I was greeted with the glorious sight of an open path before me. With the passing of the storm front, the wind had shifted directions, and I was into a headwind now, perfect for my needs. I pushed the throttle to full and pulled back gently on the yoke. I felt the wheels leave the ground, now free from the snow's drag, and continued my climb until I was above the trees and gently banking back toward the south, towards home. As I passed over the landing strip, I thought I could just make out a black shape on the ground below, stretching and snaking along after me in its futile pursuit before I lost it in the trees. The engine miss returned after another 10 minutes of flying, but Maggie carried me back to safety. She always took care of me. 40 minutes later, I was back on the ground in Fairbanks and taxiing for the hangar. Stopping the bush plane just outside, I shut her down, unbuckled myself, and carefully climbed down to the runway, where my body fought with itself for which was going to happen first, the puking or the passing out. At this point, I'd happily suffer either. Mike Nichols came jogging out of the hangar after hearing my approach and helped steady me. "Jesus, Hoop, you gave us all a scare." He smiled amiably. "It must have been a hell of a flight. You look like you saw a ghost, man." I could only nod and stumble my way toward the warmth of the hangar, grateful for his shoulder to brace myself against. Just before we reached the service door, he paused and looked back at Maggie. "Buck told me you had some engine problems, but he didn't say anything about a fire." I frowned and shook my head. "No fire. I lost some cylinders." He stood there a moment longer, an odd expression on his face before opening the door and ushering me inside. "Weird. I thought I saw some black smoke coming from under the engine right after you shut her down." We were told never to enter Zone 13. One ranger did. I've worked for the National Park Service for 9 years now, most of it out west. Yellowstone, Zion, even Denali for a while. But nothing compares to the time I spent in Northern California, tucked deep into the Shasta Trinity National Forest. They assigned me to a ranger station about 2 hours from the nearest town, a speck of civilization called Weaverville. Population maybe 3,500 if you count the dogs. The work was the usual: trail checks, emergency calls, guiding lost hikers back to camp before dark. But every station has its own unwritten rules. You learn them from the guys who've been there too long. Most of the time, it's stuff like, don't go into the gulch after rainfall. The mud eats trucks. Or, if you hear flute music past midnight, ignore it. Jokes, you think, until they're not. At Shasta, there was one rule carved into the corkboard above the desk in the ranger office. Do not enter Zone 13, not for any reason. I figured it was a code. Maybe the area was unstable, maybe it had old mines or something. Every ranger knew about it, but no one talked about it. If you asked, you just get a stare like you'd said something dirty in church. It wasn't even on the visitor maps. The chunk of the forest bordered by coordinates marked in faded red ink on a weathered topo map above the old fire safe. It took me 6 weeks to even bring it up with Martin, the oldest guy on our team. Quiet, retired military type, built like a tree stump and smelled faintly of menthol and burnt coffee. One night I asked him straight up after a few beers. "Hey man," I said, "what's with Zone 13? Martin didn't laugh. He didn't even look at me, just said, "Don't go in there." "Why not?" I asked. He waited, sipped his beer, then said, "We lost a guy in 97, never found his pack, not a footprint, just gone." I pressed, trying to lighten the mood. "So it's cursed?" He gave me a look I'll never forget, not angry, just tired. "We found his boot 5 years later," he said, "hanging 20 feet up in a pine. No blood, no scratches, just one boot, laces still tied." I didn't ask again after that. Months passed, nothing strange. I filed reports, handled drunken campers, even helped pull a black bear out of a porta potty once, ranger stuff. Then around mid-September, we got a report of a missing couple. 30-somethings from Oregon, real REI catalog types. They'd checked in at the Northern Trailhead, said they were hiking down toward a remote fishing stream, hadn't shown up for their Airbnb checkout in Redding. When I checked their permit route, my stomach dropped. Their GPS tracker had last pinged right near the edge of Zone 13. Protocol said we wait 24 hours before sending a team, but I knew if we waited, they'd be bones and bear scat. So I radioed dispatch and told them I was heading out solo. It was about an hour before dusk when I hit the trail. My pack loaded and rifle slung over my shoulder, more out of habit than necessity. The forest felt different that evening, heavy somehow. The air smelled metallic, and the trees seemed closer together than usual. I found one of the couple's granola wrappers on a mossy log just off the path. That wasn't a good sign. Hikers don't litter out here, not the crunchy types. 30 minutes in, I found their tent, or rather, what was left of it. The frame was still standing, but the fabric had been shredded like someone had taken a dozen box cutters to it. Not torn by animals, no claw marks, no bite holes, just long, clean slashes down every panel. Their gear was scattered, untouched, backpack, shoes, clothes still folded, even their hydro flask was upright. But there was no blood, no bodies, not even a trail, just silence. I did a slow circle, heart pounding. My breath was loud. I tried radioing, but all I got was static. Then something buzzed behind me. I spun around, but it was just a fly. Or at least I thought it was, until I noticed the buzzing didn't stop. It grew. It was everywhere, coming from the trees, the soil, my goddamn boots. A low-frequency hum like a swarm of bees inside a metal drum. It made my jaw ache. My eyes watered. I backed away from the campsite, deeper into the woods without realizing it. And then I saw it. A tree. Not just a tree. The tree. It was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. The bark looked melted, like plastic burned in a fire. And it wasn't standing straight. It leaned slightly, but the top seemed to twist like a spiral staircase. The buzzing was loudest there. I approached. I don't know why. Curiosity? Instinct? Maybe something else. On the bark, someone had carved words, not with a knife. They looked scratched in like fingernails. The ground is hungry. Before I could even process that, I heard footsteps, fast, heavy, crashing through the brush. I raised my rifle and shouted, "This is the Park Service. Identify yourself." Nothing. Then whispering. It was close. Behind my ear. Close. I turned. No one. But the tent was gone. Completely. Not collapsed. Gone. Even the poles. As if it had never been there. And that was when I realized I had crossed into Zone 13. I froze. Every hair on my arms lifted. My instincts screamed at me to move, but I couldn't tell which direction was out. My GPS was clipped to my chest rig, blinking red like it had just died. I tapped the screen. Nothing. No signal, no compass, not even a damn clock. The tree with the twisted trunk was still there behind me, and the buzzing had faded to a low pulse, like it was under my skin now instead of in the air. I forced my legs to move and walked in what I thought was west. My boots sank deeper with every step. The soil here wasn't right, damp, but not from rain, thick and black like oil-soaked sand. I kept walking. 5 minutes, 10, and then I noticed something else. The birds were gone, no chirping, no squirrels, not even the wind through the trees, just silence. Then I spotted movement. At first I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but it was standing upright, motionless, just beyond the tree line, maybe 50 feet away. Its outline was all wrong, too thin, too tall, limbs too long. I called out, "Hey, I'm with the Forest Service, are you hurt?" No answer, just a slow, jerky tilt of its head. I blinked, and it was gone. Not like it walked away, more like it flicked out of existence, like a skipped frame in a video. Now, I did start running. I don't know how long I sprinted, crashing through brambles and limbs that whipped my face and arms. I didn't care. I just needed out, needed daylight, needed something that felt real. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing. My knees buckled, and I fell forward into the dirt, panting. Then I saw the fire ring, charcoal, burnt logs, empty beer cans, old ones, faded, rusted, Coors Light pull-tab style, the kind they haven't made since the 80s. Next to the ring was a rotted backpack. The canvas was split wide open like it had been slashed. Inside was a spiral notebook, its cover swollen from rain. I flipped it open. The writing was barely legible, smeared and chaotic, but one sentence was underlined, scrawled across an entire page in shaking black ink. "I've walked for 3 days and keep ending up back here. It's not letting me leave." I dropped the notebook. My fingers were trembling. I could feel something watching me again. I spun in a slow circle, trying to stay calm, but there was no path, just dense trees in every direction. Then I heard voices, far away, echoing but familiar, radios, barking dogs. Search and rescue. I bolted toward the sound. Branches clawed at my arms. I nearly ate dirt multiple times, but I kept going. And sure enough, I saw headlamps through the trees. 4 or 5 of them. "Hey!" I screamed. "Hey, over here." The lights paused, then one turned toward me. I saw figures, people, shapes in uniform. I broke through the last of the brush, falling at their feet. They didn't move, didn't speak. The lights weren't attached to headlamps. They were floating. One blinked out, then another, then all of them. I was in pitch black. Then the buzzing started again, louder, closer, like it was inside my skull. I tried to scream, but my voice died in my throat. My ears rang. My vision blurred. I felt something pulling me down. Not gravity, not vertigo. Like the ground was breathing in and I was the air. I staggered backward and tripped. When I hit the dirt, the world tilted. The clearing snapped back into place. The lights were gone. The trees looked normal again. No sounds, no whispering, no footprints. But in the dirt beside me, freshly carved, were the words, "Stay. You're one of us now." And below that, my name, not my badge number, not Ranger, my full name, first, middle, and last, written like someone had been waiting. I don't remember standing up. 1 second I was on my knees, staring at my name, scrawled into the dirt like a headstone. The next, I was moving again, stumbling through brush with blood in my mouth and panic screaming inside my skull. The air had changed again. It wasn't cold anymore. It was warm. Wrong. Warm, like the inside of an animal's mouth, and it stank. Not rotting meat, something older like moldy fur and copper, like wet pennies soaked in a dead thing's breath. I knew I was deep now, deeper than I should have been. The trees were thicker, bark all gnarled and blistered like it had grown tumors. Some trunks had holes, not natural ones, but carved perfect circles, like someone had drilled into them long ago and never came back to finish. And then I saw the markers. Not official trail signs, no paint or flags. These were bones, small ones, hung from branches in delicate patterns, strung with twine that looked handmade, like vines twisted and sun-bleached. I stopped beneath one that had what looked like a child's jawbone swinging gently in the still air. That's when I heard the voices again, closer this time. Low, murmuring, male and female. Not whispering, but not loud either, like people trying not to be overheard. I crouched instinctively and crept forward, trying to stay quiet. I moved through the trees like a ghost, the way they train us in search and rescue when we're tracking someone who might be armed or unstable. My boot caught on a root, and I almost went down, but I caught myself against a tree. That's when I saw the fire. Not orange, blue, burning low in a small clearing ahead. Around it were 3 people. At least, I think they were people. They were wearing tattered hiking gear, layers of mismatched clothes that looked decades old. One of them had duct tape around their head, covering their eyes. Another was barefoot, toes black with dirt or blood, maybe both. The third one turned suddenly, like they heard me. And I swear to God, their mouth stretched too far when they smiled. "Hey," the barefoot one called out, voice thin and cheerful, like they were greeting a neighbor across the fence. Another one? I didn't answer. The one with the tape around their face sniffed the air, then tilted their head and muttered, "Fresh, still has skin on." The one who smiled took a step toward me, arms out. "Don't be scared, you're just early, that's all." I ran. Didn't think, didn't speak, just tore through the woods like something was chasing me, though I never turned around to check. My arms were scratched raw. My breath came in rasps. I ran until my knees buckled and I hit the ground hard, head smacking against a rock or root. I must have blacked out because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. Real morning. Sunlight cutting through the canopy in golden streaks, birdsong filling the air. I sat up. My body ached. My shirt was soaked through with sweat and maybe some blood. I was alone. No fire, no bone charms, no blue flames or barefoot freaks. With 2 wide grins, I pulled my GPS from my pack. Dead. No surprise. I climbed a ridge, desperate to get elevation. Found a signal flickering like a dying light bulb, just enough to ping my coordinates. I wasn't in Zone 13 anymore. I was 4 miles from where I'd started. No trail, no markers. But I knew how to get back. My training kicked in. I made it to a ranger station by nightfall, not my own, but a remote field post manned by a part-timer named Scott. He took one look at me and said, "Jesus Christ, you look like hell." I asked him if there was a working radio. He nodded. I called it in, told them I needed evac, claimed I slipped, got turned around, nothing more. I didn't say a word about the fire or the people or the buzzing. Not yet. They sent a chopper the next morning. When I got back, Martin was waiting. He didn't ask questions, didn't scold, just handed me a cigarette and a coffee, then muttered, "You went in, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He said, "Check your phone." So I did. There were pictures. Grainy, dark, like they'd been taken through a fogged-up window. And in each one I was asleep in the dirt in the woods, and always behind me, just in the shadows, a figure, different in each photo, sometimes tall, sometimes hunched. One was crawling on all fours. One had no face. The last photo, it was a close-up of me, eyes open, staring dead at the camera. I never took that picture. Martin just said, "Zone 13 doesn't let go. You might have left it, but it didn't leave you." I didn't sleep for days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw trees leaning toward me. I heard whispering in a language I don't think exists. Worse, I felt watched, like something had hitched a ride back with me, or just sitting quiet in the back seat of my mind. I didn't quit right away. I told myself I could push through it, pretend it hadn't happened. Hell, maybe I wanted to believe I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Sleep deprivation, dehydration, some rogue mold spores, whatever excuse kept my brain from snapping in two. But then the photos started changing. I deleted them all, wiped my phone clean, reset everything. I even swapped phones, bought a new one at the Target in Reading. But one night I was scrolling through my gallery and there it was again. That same photo, the one of me staring into the lens like a corpse that had just remembered how to blink. It was in a folder called Recents. I don't have any apps that auto back up. I didn't even have service. That's when I started seeing her. She wasn't part of the original trip. I'm sure of it. The couple that went missing. I reviewed their file 3 times. Mark Dunley and Caitlin Fry, both 36, drove a white Subaru Forester and brought a golden retriever named Max. We found the car, found the dog, dead, unfortunately, but there was never a mention of anyone else. But now, I keep seeing this woman in my dreams. She's wearing a red Columbia jacket, hiking boots, her black hair is braided, and her skin is sunburned, like she's been out there for days. In the dream, she stands at the edge of the clearing with the blue fire, just stands there, staring into it while those things talk to each other behind her. She doesn't look scared. She looks resigned, like she belongs. I saw her for real 2 weeks later. It was during a public safety sweep. I was with 2 other rangers, Callum and Eric. We were checking trail markers after a big storm swept through. Normal stuff. We'd parked the ATVs near Pine Ridge, maybe a mile north of Zone 13's edge, far enough not to raise red flags. We were halfway through a downlog detour when Callum stopped dead and pointed into the trees. Is that a person? Sure enough, about 30 yards away, partially obscured by low branches, was a figure, red jacket, braided hair, just standing. "Ma'am," I called out. "Do you need assistance?" She didn't respond. Callum and Eric flanked around while I moved forward slowly. "We're with the Park Service. If you're lost, we can help." Still no answer. When I got close enough, I saw she was barefoot. Her soles were blackened with sap and mud. She had pine needles stuck in her braid, and her eyes were glassy, staring past me like I wasn't even there. Then she smiled. Not creepy, not overly wide or strange, just a soft, sad little smile, like she knew something I didn't. And then she turned and walked into a pine, into it. No opening, no crevice, just bark and trunk, like she melted through it. Eric came running up seconds later, breathless. "Where'd she go?" I pointed to the tree. I don't know." Callum radioed it in. We filed a report. Said she was hallucinating, that she ran off. We had to say that because if we'd told the truth, they'd have put us under psych evals, or worse, kicked us off the force and buried the paperwork. But that night, she showed up in my room, not physically, not at first. It started with that smell again, the same warm, rotten copper and dirt scent from Zone 13. I woke up gagging, heart pounding. The cabin was dark except for the blinking light on the router. Then my phone lit up. No call, no message, just a picture. Her face, close up, blurry but unmistakable, captioned underneath in plain white font, "You brought it back." I flung the phone across the room and grabbed my radio. Static. Dead. I slept in my truck that night, engine running, keys clenched in my hand. But sleep's not the problem anymore. Waking up is. Because now, every morning, something has changed. My toothbrush is wet, even if I didn't use it. There are fresh boot prints by the door, smaller than mine. Twice now I've found moss on my floorboards. And this morning, there was a voice on the baby monitor we use for the outpost's weather station. Just one word, played on a loop, stay. I haven't told anyone yet, but I think Zone 13 is leaking. The worst part about something following you is realizing you let it in. It's not like a raccoon breaking into your tent or a storm sneaking up on a ridge. Those things are obvious. Real. What I brought back from Zone 13, it's quieter, patient, like it knows it has time. I started hearing the trees whispering at night. Not the wind, not animals. I know what both of those sound like. This was different. A dry rustling, rhythmic, almost human, like breath through teeth, like words just below hearing. And then things started going missing. First, it was small stuff, my compass, an old flashlight, one of my boots. Thought maybe raccoons dragged them off or a rookie ranger borrowed something without asking. But then a chunk of my journal went missing. Pages ripped out clean, right down the middle of an entry I'd written about the red jacket woman. The next day, the pages were back, but the handwriting on them wasn't mine. The loops were tight, frantic, scratched deep in the paper, like whoever wrote it was pressing hard enough to rip through. There were only 2 lines. The roots go deeper than you think. Stop digging. I burned the pages. Didn't help. Martin noticed I'd gone quiet. He tried to pull me aside after our morning sweep. Said I looked like death warmed over and asked if I was using. I laughed in his face and told him I hadn't slept more than 2 hours in a week. He got real still, said, "It's picking at you. That's how it starts." I asked, "What does?" He shook his head. Zone 13 isn't a place. Not really. It's a crack, and once you're close enough to hear what's inside, it hears you too. Then it doesn't matter if you leave. You're marked. He said he knew because he had been marked once too. Back in '88, before they called it Zone 13, before it was even on the internal maps. They used to just call it the Crooked Hollow, but after 5 Rangers disappeared over the years, one of them Martin's own cousin, they gave it a new name and started pretending it didn't exist. I asked him what he saw in there. He didn't answer. Just pulled up his sleeve. The scar on his arm looked like it had teeth marks. Not animal, human. Jaw too narrow. Too many incisors. "You ever seen a forest spit someone out?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. That night, the door to my cabin opened by itself. I'd locked it, triple-checked, even jammed a wedge under it. Didn't matter. It creaked open slow, like something knew I was waiting for it. I stood in the hallway with a knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The beam shook with my grip, flickering against the open frame. There was nothing there, just the trail outside, glowing faintly under the moon, and the footprints, bare fresh, leading in. The smell was back. Wet pennies, mushrooms, rot, and the whispering. The whispering was so loud I nearly dropped to my knees. Then a voice, clearer than the rest, cut through. Not loud, just inside me. "Come back." I ran. I didn't pack. I didn't leave a note. I jumped in the truck, tore down the dirt road so fast I nearly flipped the thing on a blind corner. I drove until sunrise, all the way to a Best Western outside Chico. Slept in the parking lot with a pocket knife clenched in my fist. When I went inside to get a room, the receptionist asked if I was with the forestry department. I said yes. She smiled and handed me a key. "I think she's already waiting for you," she said. I froze. "Who?" I asked. The receptionist looked confused. "Your wife," she said. "Didn't you say she'd check in ahead of you?" Said her name was Caitlin. My blood turned to ice. Caitlin Fry was the woman who went missing from the original couple, the one we never found. I took the key. Room 207. When I opened the door, the room was dark. Curtains drawn, TV static crackling on mute. The air reeked of soil and mildew, and something else, something crawling. There was someone sitting on the edge of the bed, still facing away from me, wearing a red Columbia jacket, bare feet flat on the carpet. "Caitlin," I said. "Mina." She didn't turn, but in the reflection of the TV, I saw her face. It wasn't the one from the missing persons file. It was mine, twisted, half-melted, eyes wide with something that wasn't shock or fear, but understanding. I backed out of the room and slammed the door. When I looked again, the room number was gone, just a blank door like no one had ever stayed there. But when I got back in the truck, my name badge was gone. In its place, tucked neatly into the driver's seat, was a compass. The old one. The one I lost in Zone 13. The needle was spinning, and on the back, scratched into the metal like a warning left too late, were 3 words: "You were warned." I didn't go back to Shasta right away. I couldn't. I drifted from motel to motel, losing time. Days slipped through my fingers like fog. I'd wake up in strange towns with pine needles in my pockets, dirt under my nails. No memory of how I got there. Once I came to in a diner bathroom, blood on my shirt, not mine, and a matchbook in my hand that read Trailhead Bar, Tula Lake. I'd never been to Tula Lake, but the bartender knew my name. He didn't ask for a tab, just nodded and said, "You still smell like the forest." Eventually, I got tired of running. You can only fight gravity so long before you let it pull you under. So I went back, told Martin I needed to speak with him alone. We sat in the back of the supply shed, the air thick with gasoline and sweat. I laid it all out. Everything. The woman, the photos, the whispering, the motel, the compass, even the voice that had started answering my thoughts at night when the walls went quiet. He didn't flinch, just stared at the floor, hands on his knees like he was waiting for the part where I'd finally admit it. "You hear it now," he said. Not a question. I nodded. He lit a cigarette with fingers that shook. Once it knows your name, he said, it doesn't matter where you are. You could be sitting in a Starbucks in downtown LA. It'll find you. I asked him if there was any way to stop it. He exhaled slow. You can give it someone else. That's what the stories say. Feed the ground. Trade one voice for another. He didn't have to say it. I knew what he meant. I stood up and walked out without another word. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I got called to respond to another missing person report. Solo hiker, young guy from Nevada, TikTok type, posted himself doing handstands on cliff edges and swimming naked in glacier lakes. GPS showed his last ping not far from where I found the red jacket woman. They told me to wait for backup. I didn't. I knew what I had to do. The trail swallowed me quick as if it had been waiting. The trees leaned in. Thicker, darker, wetter. The sky turned slate-colored no matter what the forecast said. I found his camp near the riverbend, tent half collapsed, gear untouched. He was inside, alive, sleeping. He looked peaceful, mouth half open, drooling into his sleeping bag. Didn't even stir when I unzipped the flap. I stared at him for a long time. I saw his phone charging off a solar pack, open to a selfie he'd just taken, smiling, carefree. I saw the compass in my hand, the needle finally still, pointing one way. I knew what it wanted. I turned away, walked 20 feet into the trees, and screamed, "Take me!" instead. Everything stopped, even the wind. Then something moved behind me. Slow, deliberate, heavy. The forest exhaled. When I turned back to the tent, it was gone. So was the boy. The riverbed was dry now, the stones black and glossy like they'd been burned. I fell to my knees. The buzzing came again, louder than ever. But now it felt inside me, like it had always been there, just waiting to wake up. That's when I realized the truth. There was never a trade, never a choice. Zone 13 doesn't bargain, it waits. And when you step over that invisible line, even for a second, you're not a visitor. You're soil. Now I'm the one who writes the warning on the corkboard. Do not enter Zone 13, not for any reason. Because it's not about curiosity or bravery, it's about containment. And if you feel the urge to find it, that pull in your chest that makes you want to see what's past the last trail marker, that means it already knows your name, and it's already begun digging. The morning sun spilled golden light over the rugged peaks of the park, a sprawling expanse of wilderness that had become my charge, my sanctuary, my responsibility. I'd always pictured being a park ranger as a tranquil vocation, a caretaker of nature's grandeur. The job description, however, neglected to mention the moments that would shatter the calm, leaving you with a lingering sense of disquiet that no amount of mountain air could dispel. As I patrolled the familiar trails in my truck, the scent of pine and earth was a constant companion. The park was an untamed thing, both fierce and beautiful, with rivers that carved through the land and forests that whispered secrets. I offered directions to a young couple eager for adventure, their faces alight with the joy of the unexplored. That was part of the job I loved, being a guide to those who sought to lose themselves in nature, if only to find something new within. By midday, I'd made my rounds, checked licenses, shared polite nods with anglers who were more hopeful than successful, and steered day hikers away from paths that were less forgiving than they appeared. It was the routine I relished, a steady rhythm like the ebb and flow of the seasons. Until it wasn't. It was by chance, following the trail of an eagle soaring overhead, that I stumbled upon the campsite. 5 tents stood in a clearing a stone's throw from the trail, their fabric doors zipped tight against intruders of any kind. It struck me as odd, the stillness of it all. By this hour, the occupants should have been up and about, their laughter and chatter mingling with the sounds of the forest. But there was nothing. Only silence. I cleared my throat, the sound harsh in the quiet, and announced myself. "Park Ranger," I called out, expecting the rustle of movement, the emergence of sleepy faces. But the forest held its breath and the silence grew heavier. "Anyone there?" My voice was louder this time, tinged with the unease that crept into my bones. The absence of response weighed on me as I approached the nearest tent. A flicker of something, like dread, fluttered in my chest as I reached for the zipper. "I'm going to open up," I warned, my hand unsteady. The tent interior was a portrait of orderliness. Sleeping bags neatly rolled, provisions tucked away, no sign of hasty departure or struggle. It was as if the campers had simply vanished, leaving behind a tableau of an interrupted life. The embers of their last fire were cold, and the low hum of insects was the only soundtrack. With methodical precision, I checked each tent, finding the same unsettling meticulousness. A sense of wrongness settled over me like a cloud, casting a shadow over the sun-dappled ground. Something about this place, about today, felt off-kilter. I was no stranger to the occasional bout of intuition, the ranger's sixth sense that something in the woods was amiss. This time, it screamed at me, a silent alarm that rang clear as a bell in my mind. By the time I re-zipped the final tent, my decision was made. I would return to the trailhead, check for vehicles. Perhaps they'd gone into town, I reasoned, but as I made my way back, the unease grew. Each rustle in the underbrush, each snap of a twig seemed amplified. A chorus of disquiet that sang a warning. I was a man of the wild, a steward of these lands. But in that moment, as the shadows lengthened and a chill descended with the setting sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the one being watched, the one out of place in the untamed vastness of the park. The afternoon waned, light filtering through the towering pines in shards that barely touched the forest floor. I should have been back at the station, filing reports, finishing up paperwork. Instead, I was here, at the edge of a clearing that had no right to be as silent as a grave. I let the engine idle, the soft purr of the truck a stark contrast to the stillness outside. The campsite was just as I'd left it, tents standing sentinel in their neat little row. I should have felt relief at the lack of chaos, but my gut knotted tighter with every passing second. With a sigh, I killed the engine and stepped out, the door shutting with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the trees. The air was different, charged, almost metallic. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into a different world, one that watched and waited with bated breath. "Hello?" My voice felt thin, devoured by the expansive silence. I walked the perimeter, boots crunching softly on the forest detritus. The campfire was a scatter of charred wood and ash, the remnants of human warmth long since dissipated. The sun dipped lower, a dying ember on the horizon, and shadows gathered with an eagerness that felt almost sentient. I checked my radio, ensuring it was on and within reach. Not that I expected trouble, but the ranger's creed of "be prepared" was etched deep in my bones. I approached the tents again, unzipping one and peering inside. It was untouched, a still life of what should have been a bustling campsite. I re-zipped it, a whisper of nylon the only sound in a world gone mute. The forest had always been a living thing, full of whispers and rustles, the occasional snap of a branch, a comforting reminder of its vitality. But now, it was as if every creature, every insect had to hold its breath, and then, in an instant, it happened. The silence broke, but not with the return of life's symphony. No, it was the absence of sound that marked the change. A silence so profound, so complete, it felt like a shroud. I froze, every sense straining against the unnatural quiet. My hand drifted to the canister of bear spray on my belt, the weight of it cold and reassuring against my palm. I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of life. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of green and the growing dread that I was not alone. That's when I heard it. The softest whisper of a footfall, a muted crunch that sent a shiver down my spine. It was deliberate, a slow, measured step that was too heavy to belong to any forest creature I knew. I pivoted, the bear spray raised in a silent threat. "Show yourself," I demanded, the authority of my position a thin veneer over the throb of my racing heart. The steps continued, a slow circling of predator and prey. I was no stranger to the dangers of the wild, but this was different. This was a dance with something unknown, something that defied the natural order I had come to know. As the light faded and the forest closed in, I knew I had to make a choice: wait for the unseen to reveal itself, or retreat to the safety of the trailhead. With a final look at the silent campsite, I turned my back on the unknown and chose the path that led away from the deepening shadows. But as I walked, I could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes tracking every step, every breath. As night fell like a curtain on the day's disquieting end, dawn broke with a cold clarity. Shards of sunlight cut through the dense canopy, doing little to warm the chill that had settled in my bones. The park, a vast kingdom of green and wild things, had always been my refuge. But since yesterday, it had taken on the menacing air of a crypt. I sat in my truck at the trailhead, the engine idling like a growl in the quiet, staring at the windshield but seeing the abandoned tents. The unease had festered overnight into a hard knot. 5 tents. 5 souls unaccounted for. The solitude of the park now felt like isolation, and the silence of the campsite replayed in my mind a haunting loop. With a grunt, I grabbed the radio. The static crackle was a harsh intrusion. I reported in, providing descriptions and license plate numbers. The replies came back. Locals in their 20s, a weekend getaway with friends who had now vanished into the wilderness. I stuffed the radio back into its cradle and stepped out of the truck, the crisp air biting at my cheeks. My eyes swept the parking area. 4 cars, 1 truck, a tableau untouched since yesterday. A sigh escaped me, fogging the air as I contemplated the next move. I retraced my steps down the trail, the same path I'd taken countless times before, but now each rustle in the underbrush, each snapped twig, seemed loaded with intent. I was a man used to tracking, used to being the predator, not the prey. Yet the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin I couldn't shake. Reaching the campsite, I found it as I'd left it, eerily pristine. The tents stood mute against the encroaching shadows. My hand hovered over the zipper of the nearest tent. Hesitation was a bitter taste in my mouth. I could feel the day's end approaching, the light waning, the forest preparing for its nocturnal secrets. The silence was suffocating, the lack of human noise, the absence of laughter and life. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. My call for assistance earlier had been a decision made with reluctance, but as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in strokes of fire and blood, I knew it was the right one. As the twilight deepened, a primeval instinct screamed within me. Something was wrong. Something beyond the scope of missing campers and abandoned gear. I was no longer a guardian of the park. I had become part of a darker narrative, one written in the unseen and the unknown. I unholstered the bear spray, the canister cool and solid in my grip. I'd faced down charging elk, stared into the yellow eyes of mountain lions. But this was a fear without a face, a threat that slithered through the underbrush of my mind, leaving trails of dread. The first star blinked into existence as I made my decision. The campsite gave me nothing, the forest even less, so I would have to return to the station to mount a proper search. The night was no time to challenge the unknown. But as I turned to leave, a branch snapped with the sharpness of a gunshot, and the forest fell deathly silent once more. The sense of being hunted, of being prey, was a mantle heavy on my shoulders as I made my way back to the trailhead. The darkness at my heels and the weight of the missing like a shroud upon the land. The sun shouldered its way above the horizon, spilling a pale light that did little to warm the chill in my marrow. I hadn't slept. Couldn't, even if I tried. The station was abuzz with activity, a stark contrast to the uneasy stillness of the woods. I sipped bitter coffee, watching the steam rise like specters into the cold morning air. The faces around me were taut with concern, the weight of the missing campers a silent drumbeat in everyone's mind. A specialist tracker had been called in, a wiry woman with eyes like flint, and a gait was all business. We huddled over maps spread on the hood of a cruiser, her finger tracing the trails with a predatory precision. I felt the pull, the need to get back out there, to find answers, to find them. With the tracker leading, we made our way to the campsite. The tents looked forlorn in the morning light, a tableau of abandonment that was at odds with the natural beauty surrounding us. I recounted the events of the previous day, my voice sounding hollow in the crisp air. The tracker moved with a silence that seemed to resonate with the forest. We found nothing new at the campsite, no signs of struggle, no traces of their passage. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and taken them. I watched her crouch, examining the ground. Her movements were precise, almost reverent. She paused, looked up, and met my gaze. "We're not alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We pushed further into the woods, away from the campsite, away from the trail. It wasn't long before the tracker held up a hand, her body tense. There was a cave ahead, hidden by the foliage, its mouth open like a dark wound on the mountainside. We approached with caution, the air growing colder as we neared the entrance. A fetid smell wafted from the darkness, the scent of decay. The tracker signaled for me to follow, and we entered the cave, the beams from our flashlights cutting through the blackness. What we found within stopped me cold, a grisly scene, the remnants of violence etched into the very stone. Bones, some fresh, some old, littered the ground. The walls were painted with the evidence of savagery, and in the depths of the cave, we saw it. The creature was an aberration, a thing of nightmares made flesh. It was hulking and misshapen, its eyes reflecting our lights with a malevolent intelligence. It moved with startling speed, its growl a visceral thing that seemed to vibrate through the stone beneath our feet. We fought. The tracker was thrown aside like a rag doll, her screams echoing off the walls. I sprayed the creature with bear mace, but it only seemed to enrage it further. The cave became a blur of movement and terror. I remember the cold shock of falling, the creature's breath hot on my neck, and then darkness as I hit the ground. When I came to, the creature was gone. The tracker was silent, and the weight of the dead pressed in around me. I scrambled to my feet, my mind a whirl of panic and fear. The cave, once merely a structure of stone, had become a tomb, a testament to the brutal reality that sometimes the wild is not just indifferent, but cruel, sentient. My consciousness clawed its way back, a reluctant swimmer surfacing from the depths of a dark, cold lake. Pain lanced through my ribs with each ragged breath, a stark reminder of the creature's power. The tracker lay still, barely rising, a grim tapestry of our struggle against the beast, etched in the dirt and blood around us. The cave was a cathedral of horrors. Its walls wept with the blood of the creature's prey. The stench of death was omnipresent, an assault on the senses that threatened to overwhelm me. We were in the belly of the beast, both literally and figuratively. With effort, I propped myself up against the cold stone, my flashlight's beam a feeble protest against the enveloping darkness. The silence of the cave was absolute, a pressing force that seemed eager to swallow any noise we might make. But the silence was a lie. I realized it was the creature's accomplice, hiding its movements, masking its intentions. The tracker's eyes flickered open, confusion and fear warring in their depths before settling into a determined glare. We shared a nod, a silent agreement that we were not yet done, that we would not go quietly into that dark night. We moved, our bodies protesting, a symphony of aches and sharp stabs of pain. We had to find the hiker, the one we had seen moving in the pit. The pit, a grave not yet sealed, a place of waiting for those the creature had chosen to toy with before the end. Our search was methodical, born of a desperation that sharpened our senses. We found her, the hiker. Her eyes wide with terror and relief, we fashioned a rope from the detritus of the cave, clothing torn from the bodies of the less fortunate. She was weak, but alive, and that was a victory against the darkness. We were not out of the creature's woods yet, though. It returned, a looming nightmare, its visage a grotesque mockery of nature. Its eyes held an intelligence that spoke of a malevolent awareness, a knowing that went beyond animal instinct. The fight was brutal, a dance with death in the pale light of our flashlights. I remember the sound of my own breath, ragged and frantic, as I faced the monstrosity. It was a battle not just for life, but for sanity, against the realization that such things walked in the same world I had once thought I understood. In the end, it was a rock, a simple, unassuming weapon, wielded with the last vestiges of my strength, that turned the tide. The creature reeled, its roar a sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. And then it was on me, its weight a mountain, its breath a gale of rot and malice. But the creature was wounded, its movements sluggish. With a cry that was half scream, half defiant roar, I fought. The beast faltered, stumbled, and then with a final effort I drove it off, sending it crashing into the darkness. We collapsed, the hiker, the tracker, and I, a tangle of limbs and exhaustion. The danger was not yet past, but for a moment we could breathe, could allow ourselves the luxury of hope. Outside, the park was waking up, sunlight creeping across the land. But in the cave, we grappled with the aftermath of our encounter, the reality that the world was far stranger and more terrifying than we had ever imagined. The aftermath felt like walking through a dream, the kind that lingers at the edges of your waking mind, too tenacious to be dismissed by the morning light. The creature lay still, a mass of fur and flesh that no longer inspired fear, just a profound sense of sorrow for the lives it had taken. I emerged from the cave into the blinding light of a new day, the air fresh with the scent of pine and the earthy musk of the forest. The rescue teams had arrived, a flurry of motion and urgent voices. I watched them, their faces a blend of relief and horror as they took in the scene, the scattered remnants of the campers, the silence of the tracker, the ragged survivors we were. They asked questions, their notebooks ready to document the unbelievable. I recounted the events, my voice flat, the words tasting of dust and disbelief. The surviving hiker was whisked away on a stretcher, her eyes meeting mine in a silent thank you. I nodded, a gesture of feeble acknowledgement of the bond formed in the shadow of death. I sat on the bumper of an ambulance, the world around me a cacophony of radio chatter and boots on the ground. The head ranger approached, his expression a mix of concern and something akin to pride. "You did good," he said, though the words felt hollow against the backdrop of such loss. The report they handed me was a litany of names, each a life snuffed out in the prime of its existence, 26 in total, including the brave tracker who had fought alongside me. The creature, they speculated, was some aberration, a twist of nature's design that defied explanation. But in the end, it was dead, and with it, died the nightmare that had gripped the park. I returned to the job, to the routine of trails and tourists, but something fundamental had shifted. The knife I had used to defend us against the creature rested heavy on my hip, its blade stained with the evidence of our struggle. I hadn't cleaned it, a silent tribute to those who hadn't made it out, and a reminder of the thin line between the known and the unknown. I carried more than just the knife now, a .44 Magnum, a weight on my other hip, a concession to the newfound knowledge that wild held more than just beauty and tranquility. It was a burden I accepted, the weight of it a constant companion as I patrolled the same trails, watched over the same vistas. I became something new in the wake of that encounter. A guardian, not just of the park and its visitors, but of the thin veneer that separates civilization from the wild chaos that lurks in the uncharted shadows. Each rustle in the underbrush, every snapped twig, now held the possibility of hidden dangers. But I was ready to protect, to serve, and if necessary, to confront the darkness. The creature had changed me, honed me into something harder, more vigilant. I was no longer just a park ranger. I was a sentinel at the edge of a mysterious and untamed world, forever watching, forever waiting. I pulled my truck into the airport's short-term parking lot, the gravel crunching under the tires like dry bones. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like the years since I'd last seen Riker, my nephew, a city boy, born and bred, but with a yearning for the great outdoors that I could only attribute to some dormant family gene, the The terminal doors slid open, and there he was, a backpack slung over one shoulder and a look of weary excitement on his face. He'd grown taller, his features more defined, but the youthful glint in his eyes was as familiar as the mountain trails I called home. "Uncle," he shouted, dropping his bag and rushing toward me. I braced myself for the impact of a bear hug. "Man, it's been too long." "Sure has, kid," I said, patting him on the back. "You ready for a week in the wild?" "Born ready," he grinned, retrieving his bag. The drive back to my trailer was filled with talk of college, jobs, and the mundane intricacies of city life. I listened, nodding at the right moments, but my mind was on the week ahead. The Appalachian Mountains were a different beast altogether, beautiful but unforgiving, like a siren you couldn't ignore, even when you knew better. We reached the trailer as darkness settled in, the outline of the mountains barely visible against the night sky. I fired up the grill, the sizzle of steak filling the air with a rustic aroma, potatoes wrapped in foil cooked on the side, a humble but hearty meal for the journey ahead. "So what's the plan?" Riker asked, digging into his steak with gusto. "We'll hit the trail first thing tomorrow," I said. "Got a few spots in mind that offer the best views and a good challenge." "Can't wait," he replied, his eyes lighting up at the prospect. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted from the mundane to the mysterious. The mountains had their own set of rules, a code that every hiker should know, but few ever did. I could see the skepticism in Riker's eyes, a city-bred disbelief in the inexplicable, but he'd learn. They all did. "Hey," I said as he got up to retire for the night, "make sure you close the curtains in your room, all right?" He looked puzzled. We're in the middle of nowhere, Uncle. Who's going to be peeping through the windows?" "Just trust me on this one," I said, my voice tinged with a seriousness that made him pause. "We'll talk about it tomorrow." Riker nodded, his expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. "All right, if you say so." As I lay in bed that night, the curtains tightly drawn, I thought about the red eyes I'd seen years ago peering through the window like a malevolent force from a world we're not supposed to know. I thought about Dan Williams, a fellow ranger who'd laughed off the warnings and paid the price. And as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains were watching us, waiting to see if we'd play by their rules or defy them at our peril. With the dawn of a new day, our journey into the unknown was about to begin. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the trailer, mingling with the crisp morning air that seeped in through the cracks in the windows. I glanced at the clock. 5 a.m. Early, but the mountains didn't wait for anyone. I poured myself a cup and took a sip, the bitterness jolting me awake. I heard Riker stir in the guest room, the creaking of the bed frame cutting through the silence. A few minutes later, he emerged, his eyes still heavy with sleep, but a smile on his face. "Morning, Uncle," he greeted, sniffing the air appreciatively. "That coffee smells like heaven." "Help yourself," I said, nodding toward the pot. "We've got a long day ahead." As Riker poured his coffee, I started on breakfast, scrambled eggs, bacon, and some toast. Simple, but it'd give us the energy we needed. We ate in companionable silence, both of us eager to hit the trail, but savoring these quiet moments before the day's challenges. Just as we were finishing up, Riker's eyes darted to the sliding glass door leading to the front porch. "Hey, looks like Barkley wants in," he said, getting up and heading toward the door. My heart skipped a beat. "Wait," I yelled, louder than I intended. Riker froze, his hand inches from the door handle. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" I motioned for him to follow me into the living room, my eyes never leaving the figure outside the glass door. It looked like Barkley, all right, but something was off. The eyes were too vacant, the posture too stiff. I pointed to the corner of the room where Barkley lay on his dog bed, snoring softly. "That's Barkley," I whispered, my voice tinged with an urgency I couldn't fully explain. "Don't open that door." Riker looked from the real Barkley to the imposter outside, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Is that a stray?" I shook my head. "No. It's something else, something you don't want to invite inside." As if on cue, the figure outside the door vanished, melting into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. Riker let out a shaky breath. What was that? It's hard to explain, I said, choosing my words carefully. Let's just say the mountains have their own set of rules. One of them is to make damn sure it's really your pet trying to get in. Riker stared at me, his eyes searching for a hint of jest. Finding none, he nodded slowly. All right, Uncle, I'll remember that. We spent the next half hour getting our gear ready, the atmosphere tinged with a newfound sense of urgency. As I double-checked the straps on my backpack, my thoughts drifted to the red eyes I'd seen years ago, and the doppelganger dog that had just tried to enter my home. The mountains were a place of beauty, but they were also a realm of mysteries that defied explanation. And as we stepped out the door, leaving the safety of my trailer behind, I couldn't help but wonder what other lessons the Appalachian Trail had in store for us. One thing was certain. Riker's education had just begun, and so had our journey into the heart of the unknown. The morning sun was a golden disk in the sky, casting its light over the undulating hills and dense forests of the Appalachian Trail. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of day that made you grateful to be alive, and even more grateful to be miles away from the concrete jungle. Riker and I set out, our boots crunching on the gravel path that soon gave way to a dirt trail. We were surrounded by towering trees, their leaves forming a canopy that dappled the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you can only find in the heart of nature. So what's the plan for today? Riker asked, his eyes scanning the trail ahead as if expecting it to reveal its secrets. We'll head up to Eagle Peak, I said. It's a bit of a climb, but the view from the top is worth every step. Riker grinned, his earlier apprehension replaced by the thrill of adventure. Lead the way, Uncle. We hiked in companionable silence, each lost in our own thoughts but united by the rhythm of our steps and the beauty that surrounded us. Every now and then, Riker would stop to take a photo or simply stand and breathe, his eyes wide with wonder. It was during one of these moments that I noticed the change. Riker's face grew tense, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the trees around us. You hear that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I strained my ears, listening past the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. And then I heard it, a low, droning sound like a siren but distorted, as if being played through a broken speaker. We need to get as far away from that noise as possible, I said, my voice tinged with an urgency that made Riker's eyes widen. But what if it's a weather alert or something? He protested. It's not, I said, cutting him off. Trust me. We need to move, now. We turned and started running, our boots pounding the earth as we retraced our steps. The siren grew louder, then softer, as if playing a cruel game of hide-and-seek. Just when I thought we'd put enough distance between us and the noise, it blared again, this time so close it felt like it was right on top of us. What the hell? Riker yelled, his hands clamped over his ears. And then we saw it. A towering structure that looked like an old vine-covered telephone pole, but with speakers at the top. It was moving, its base dragging along the ground as if propelled by some unseen force. The siren wailed, a deafening sound that seemed to shake the very air around us. Without a word, Riker and I turned and bolted, adrenaline fueling our steps as we ran like our lives depended on it. Because they did. As we put distance between us and that monstrosity, the siren's wail grew fainter until it was swallowed by the sounds of the forest. We didn't stop running until we were sure it was gone, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, our bodies drenched in sweat. Riker looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. What was that? I took a deep breath, my mind racing as I tried to find the words to explain the unexplainable. Welcome to the Appalachian Trail, I said finally. You're not in the city anymore. We found a clearing a good distance away from where the siren had nearly cornered us. Our breaths were still ragged, our hearts pounding like drumbeats in a war dance. I set down my backpack and took a swig from my water bottle, the liquid barely quenching the dryness in my throat. Riker was pacing, his eyes darting around as if expecting the trees to come alive. All right, Uncle. Spill it. What the hell is going on here? I sighed, looking at him squarely. Sit down, Riker. We need to have the talk. He hesitated, then sat on a fallen log, his eyes never leaving mine. Is this where you tell me about the birds and the bees of the Appalachian Trail? In a manner of speaking, I said, taking a seat beside him. Except these birds and bees can be deadly. I began with the curtains, recounting the night I'd seen those red eyes staring through my window. I told him about Dan Williams, a fellow ranger who'd scoffed at the old tales and ended up a lifeless husk, his face twisted in eternal horror. Riker listened, his eyes widening with each tale. And you're sure this wasn't some animal? Or maybe a trick of the light? I've been a ranger for over 2 decades, I said, my voice tinged with a hardness that made him wince. I know every animal in these parts, and none of them have red eyes that can bore into your soul. He nodded, swallowing hard. Okay, what about that siren thing? What was that? That, I said, choosing my words carefully, is something you don't ever want to get close to. It's a cryptid, a creature that defies explanation. It lures you in with that siren sound, and if it catches you, well, let's just say you don't want to find out. Wrecker looked at me, his eyes searching for a hint of exaggeration. You're serious, aren't you? As a heart attack, I said. There are things in these mountains that defy logic and explanation. Old folks call them spirits, demons, cryptids, whatever you want to name them. They're real and they're dangerous. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, as if exhaling his disbelief. So what do? We follow the rules, I said. Always sleep with your curtains closed. Make sure it's really your pet trying to get in, and never ever get close to that siren. He nodded, his face set in grim determination. Anything else? I hesitated, then decided he was ready. There's a creature called the Wampus Cat, a 6-legged feline bigger than a lion, with eyes that can hypnotize you. If you see it, avoid eye contact at all costs. Riker chuckled, then stopped when he saw my face. You're not joking, are you? No, Riker, I'm not, I said, standing up and shouldering my backpack. These mountains are beautiful, but they're also a minefield of the unexplained. Stick with me, follow the rules, and you'll get through this. He stood up, his eyes meeting mine. I'm with you, Uncle. Let's do this. As we resumed our hike, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. We'd escaped the siren, but the mountains had more lessons to teach, more rules to enforce, and we were just getting started. We made camp as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no artist could ever truly capture. The beauty of it was almost enough to make you forget the dangers lurking in the shadows, almost enough to lull you into a false sense of security. Almost. As Wrecker set up the tent, I gathered firewood, my eyes scanning the darkening woods. The rules were clear in my mind, each one a lifeline that could mean the difference between life and death. But there were other rules, other dangers I hadn't shared with Riker yet. How could I, when I barely understood them myself? Fire's ready, Wrecker called, snapping me out of my thoughts. I returned to camp and sat by the fire, its warmth seeping into my bones as the temperature dropped. Riker joined me, a can of beans in one hand and a look of contentment on his face. This is amazing, Uncle, he said, staring into the flames. I can't believe I've been missing out on this my whole life. It's a different world out here. I know, I said, my eyes meeting his. One that can be both beautiful and terrifying. He nodded, his expression growing serious. You mentioned other dangers earlier. What were you talking about? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. There's a creature known as the Wampus Cat. It's a 6-legged feline larger than any lion or tiger you've ever seen. It has golden eyes that can hypnotize you if you're not careful. Riker chuckled, then stopped when he saw my face. You're not kidding, are you? No, I said, my voice tinged with a gravity that made him sit up straight. Making eye contact with a Wampus Cat can put you in a trance, make you unable to move, and then, well, you become its dinner. He swallowed hard, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. What do we do if we encounter one? Your best bet is to catch it off guard and shoot it, I said, patting the rifle that lay beside me. If you don't have a gun, hide and pray it doesn't find you. Running is not an option. He nodded, his face set in grim determination. Anything else I should know? I hesitated, then decided it was time. There are other things I can't even begin to explain. Lights that dance in the sky but aren't stars. Whispers that come from nowhere. Shadows that move on their own. The key is to respect the mountains, to understand that we're merely visitors in a world we can't fully comprehend. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a newfound sense of respect. I understand, Uncle. I'll follow the rules. All of them. I nodded, satisfied. Good. That's the only way to survive out here. As we settled into our sleeping bags, the curtains of our tent tightly closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the mountains were testing us, waiting to see if we'd abide by their rules or pay the price for our ignorance. And as I drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in my mind: the real journey was just beginning, and there was no turning back. The morning sun broke through the canopy of leaves, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. We were up early, packing our gear and dousing the fire, leaving no trace of our presence. The mountains demanded respect, and we gave it willingly, knowing the price of arrogance. We've got a long hike ahead, I said, shouldering my backpack. We'll head down to the valley, then make our way to the waterfall. It's a sight to behold. Wrecker nodded, his eyes shining with anticipation. I can't wait, Uncle. This has been the most incredible experience of my life. I smiled, touched by his enthusiasm, but also wary of the dangers that still lay ahead. It's not over yet, kid. Remember, always stay alert. We set off, the trail winding its way through towering trees and overgrown bushes, each step taking us deeper into the heart of the mountains. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a smell that I'd come to associate with both life and death. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone, that something was watching us from the shadows. I glanced at Wrecker, who seemed blissfully unaware, lost in the beauty of the moment. I envied him, wished I could see the world through his eyes, if only for a moment. And then I heard it, a soft rustling in the bushes, a sound that was almost drowned out by the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves. Almost. I stopped, my hand going to the rifle slung over my shoulder. Did you hear that? Wrecker paused, his eyes scanning the trees. Before I could answer, a low growl echoed through the forest, a sound so deep and guttural it seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. I turned my eyes, meeting a pair of golden orbs that glinted from the shadows. Wampus cat, I whispered, my voice tinged with a dread that sent a chill down my spine. Wrecker looked at me, his eyes wide with terror. What do we do? Remember the rules, I said, my eyes never leaving those golden orbs. Avoid eye contact, and whatever you do, don't run. As if sensing our fear, the creature stepped into the light, its six-legged frame towering over us like a demon from the darkest corners of our nightmares. It growled again, a sound that shook us to our very core, then turned and vanished into the forest, leaving us trembling in its wake. We need to go, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Now we resumed our hike, each step weighed down by the knowledge of what lurked in the shadows. And as we made our way through the forest, one thought echoed in my mind. The mountains had let us go, but the rules had changed. The stakes raised in a game we were only beginning to understand. Somewhere in the depths of the Appalachian Trail, the golden eyes of the Wampus cat watched and waited, its growl a chilling reminder that we were merely visitors in a world we could never truly belong to. The end was just the beginning, and the real journey had yet to come.